Hello everyone, this is Peter Garay from ManageXValue.com. Today we continue our discussion around the power and utility use case for risk quantification. Specifically, we are going to cover the topic of granularity. As these companies manage significant length of electric grids and gas pipelines, and these pipelines, for example, can have completely different risk profiles at different segments. The logical question for such an organization is whether you can do the risk quantification at the asset level or even at the asset segment level, like a pipeline segment. And we designed the ManageXValue risk quantification platform specifically for this type of purpose, to be able to scale quantification to a very granular level, while at the same time be able to provide an aggregate view for the enterprise risk managers. So within the current risk analysis and the hierarchy dashboard view, you see that we are focusing now on the attack surface view, which basically provides an overview of the overall risk within the organization, but based on the various attack surfaces of this organization. So there can be IT assets, operational buildings, and most importantly, operational assets, within which there is electric operational assets and gas operational assets. And you can see for the electric business, we started to illustrate here that you can start the segmentation of these assets by their types, whether generation, transmission, or distribution. But then you can start getting into various regions or subregions and so on. With the hierarchical view, you can essentially do the analysis and you can go down to a very granular view. Obviously, as highlighted in the previous video, the more granular analysis you want to do, the more information you need. However, this higher level or better, what we call specificity, for the risk quantification model, you have the benefit that you will have a much better view around the different details for the risk profiles for the various assets or for the various segments of those assets. For the gas business, you can see that there are various pipelines, supplier pipeline or transmission infrastructure or distribution infrastructure. Here, this analysis is done at the overall pipeline level, and we don't get down into the segment, but it's as easily possible as it is for the electric grid. Now, when it comes to granularity, you can see that there are these the risk quantification results shown at the lowest level of building blocks, and everything is aggregated to the overall business. When you do a quantification at the lowest level, then it becomes possible that you can start digging into very specific areas. Like if we get to the electric distribution grid in the first region, then of course, and we eliminate the zero ones, then we reduced our focus of the analysis to the attack surface of this very specific segment of the grid. However, within the model, you can still see that what part of the business would be impacted if there are risk events at that segment of the grid. Obviously, electricity and some of the headquarter items. You can identify very specifically what are the associated risk events for that specific segment. You can see what the various impact areas, whether we talk about financial impact, reliability, or safety. What are the various threats that are very important potentially for the business. We have covered the attack surface, that we just narrowed it down to that very specific focus. And then who are the potential actors who can cause problems for that very specific segment. Which basically means that at this point, the analysis is showing the results, the current risk for this very specific segment. Having said that, this is not even the most granular view, because what you see here, when we focus on an asset, you can still get into more details in the risk register, that there are 25 scenarios, specific scenarios related to this specific asset. So the quantification is really done at the scenario level. That's the lowest level of building block from which we aggregate everything. So in this case, essentially with the 25 scenarios, you can really analyze for this particular electric grid segment, what are the potential risks, what are the most important risks and why, how protected are we with risk control measures, or how we call them protective capabilities, proactive capabilities or reactive capabilities if we need them because we cannot avoid a risk event. Of course, when you analyze only one asset, you can still look at the current risk in terms of the loss exceedance curve, and then you get the loss exceedance curve for that very specific asset, which is just a very small portion here of the total overall enterprise risk. So this is how you can see that you are just looking at a very specific segment within the overall risk profile of the business. Obviously, it doesn't make sense to compare this risk to the overall risk tolerance, because as we have discussed in a previous video, risk tolerance should be an enterprise risk level of concept, and you shouldn't really define specific risk tolerances for various assets specifically. Another example that if we want to analyze a completely different part of the business, we can get into the electric control centers. That is also a very specific asset. Obviously, it drives the electricity business for the organization. From risk events perspective, there can be various distribution or reliability issues, health and safety issues, property damage, and so on. Impact areas are also applicable in terms of segmentations. And then from threats perspective, there can be physical security threats, digital security, of course, for a control center, whether it's IT or OT. Both of them are also applicable. And then threat actors can be here malicious and non-malicious internal and external actors. Of course, these are just examples, but the point is that you can analyze the asset-specific risk for the organization coming from the risk quantification analysis. You can see here how everything is interacted for this specific asset in terms of who the actors are, what are the possible threat actions for this specific attack surface, what are the proactive capabilities, what are the potential risk events, and overall, ultimately, through the reactive capabilities, what is the residual risk? Of course, even though we are looking at a specific asset, this is a much larger asset category, so there are 126 scenarios in this case. Obviously, this is the case because, again, the more specific you become with your asset, the more granular you are, then the fewer number of specific scenarios you would probably allocate or assign to that specific asset itself. However, granularity can also have a completely different view because it's not just necessarily around the asset level, but we could focus on a specific granular threat action. For example, gas pipeline digging is a typical problem for power and utility companies with gas operations. And if we look at that very specific threat area, that again is a granular view, but not from an asset perspective, but from essentially from the threat actions dimension. So organization unit wise, you can see that obviously gas pipeline digging is applicable for the gas business. Risk events can actually cause, like gas pipeline digging can cause service disruption, of course, significant health and safety, like a gas explosion, environmental pollution, and property damage, and so on. Threats wise, we just focused on the gas pipeline digging, so you can see that that's how we are focusing on the granular part. And then attack surfaces, you can see which segments, which pipeline segments essentially are most sensitive to the gas pipeline digging. So that is point number one, that when you talk about granularity with a proper model, you can really analyze your risk landscape with a granular level, not just focusing on the very specific assets or segments of your pipelines and the electric grid, but you can also narrow that down and then be granular or do a granular analysis for various risk events or various threat actions and so on, or even actors. Having said that, the second most important point when we talk about granularity is that when we have a model that analyzes various risk events on a completely separate or independent basis, so separate analyses are done for each and every one of the potential risk events. Of course, that becomes very cumbersome and difficult to do at the asset level. That's why typically the question comes up around whether analysis can be done at the asset level. However, what is even more challenging, especially when you run a Monte-Carlo simulation, is the aggregation of the risk over or throughout the portfolio of your business, or in this case, the aggregation across all the attack surfaces, so you can see the overall business for the risk. And that aggregation is applicable not just for the attack surfaces, but across the organization unit, and then across the various risk events. As you can see, all the aggregations end up with the same average or expected result. However, this aggregation, as we discussed in a previous video, becomes more challenging as soon as you are not focusing on an aggregate or on an expected view. So if you are focusing on black swan events, essentially to identify where within your organization you should really worry about any black swan event, for example, where within your attack surface you could have significant black swan events which have very low probability but very high impact. Essentially, those are illustrated with the maximum risk levels. What you see here is that for the overall portfolio, this is much larger than the average or the expected case was. However, when you have a Monte-Carlo simulation, a so-called portfolio effect comes in, which basically means that it is very unlikely that you would see the black swans for each and every one of your attack surfaces at the same time. For example, in one specific year, all the worst case scenarios would happen throughout the attack surface. Of course, when you become more and more granular and you increase your specificity for a model, then this portfolio effect comes in even more, which basically means that it is very unlikely that each and every one of the very granular level of asset views or asset level analysis would have the worst case scenario. However, if you really want to identify the worst case black swans, then you can view or look at the really worst case scenarios for each and every one of the lowest level of building blocks and then aggregate those up at the highest levels. So as you can see, in this case, it's almost doubling the risk relative to the overall aggregate view. So the difference there is the portfolio impact, which basically means that even though this is the worst case scenario overall for the business, it is much better than if we took the worst case scenario of everything and aggregate that up. This is very relevant when you are looking for the identification of potential black swan events to make sure that you can avoid those. Here, for example, a significant portion is coming from operational assets, within which gas operational assets is the most important, gas distribution infrastructure, and of course distribution infrastructure pipes in various regions. But what is also key is that if you look at the risk events, The aggregation at that level is different than for attack surfaces, which again is just, it's a technical detail from a Monte-Carlo simulation perspective. When you are looking at the worst case scenario for the risk events, it's picking the worst case of the risk event, not considering where within the business this would occur. It just focuses on picking out the worst case scenario. Of course, as you start segmenting or cutting and slicing and dicing your focus areas, focusing on very specific attack surface, then you can easily identify what the most important black swan risk events are for that very specific attack surface. So that's point number 2 around aggregation when you talk about granularity for a power and utility company. And then lastly, why does this really matter? Well, the most important aspect of enabling the granularity for our clients and the aggregation is to be able to become much more specific around what type of risks they want to mitigate and where, how can they identify what to mitigate and where within their overall business, their overall infrastructure, which is essentially the attack surface equivalent, and then come up with risk mitigation plans that are much more effective. So instead of coming up with very high level risk mitigation programs, because the risk quantification model was done at the much higher level, and then apply a peanut butter application for the investments throughout the infrastructure. If you can become more specific, then you can really identify the most important areas where your protective capabilities are the weakest, and or potentially your threat landscape is the worst case, meaning that there can be many more initiations of certain threat actions. Then you can really become very specific and much more effective with your investments. The second part with the granularity, we will discuss it in a future video, comes when you talk about working as a team. So different parts of the organization can actually do granular risk assessments for their own risk domain. Speaking of IT security or cybersecurity, or the gas operations or electric operations business and relevant stakeholders, they can do their own granular level of analysis and do the investment optimization at that level. However, with the aggregation view, it is also relevant for the enterprise risk management teams to be able to look at all the risk domains and then see where the big ticket items are in terms of mitigating the risk. Hopefully you like this video and you learned something useful today around granularity and performing a granular risk quantification analysis using power and utility as an example. Of course, this is applicable for other organizations as well, but for power and utility companies, this is a typical question. So we wanted to make sure that our clients learn from these as they go through, because these type of videos are also available within the platform as they go through their learning process. If you have any questions or comments or concerns around this content, please let me know in the comments below. Of course, like the video if you did, and share it with anyone who you think would benefit from it. Thank you very much.